South Sudan's president pays a state visit to Israel, and there's talk of a return by Israel's prime minister. Are these signs of a deepening relationship? And if so, should Juba's neighbours be worried? What interest does Israel have in building another foothold in East Africa? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. Israel and South Sudan share no borders. The distance between Tel Aviv and Juba is about 2,000 miles. And the two nations don't have any real cultural, religious or ethnic links either. And yet Israel was one of the first countries in the world to recognise South Sudan's independence earlier this year. And in September, President Salva Kiir and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. And then this week, Kiir has made an official visit to Israel. What explains this close yet discreet relationship? Mohammed Shakir has some background.
Both sides describe Salva Kiir's trip to Israel as a historic visit, and it reveals the strength of the relationship between Tel Aviv and Juba. The Israeli president described it as a defining moment in the history of the Middle East.
For us, the rebirth, or the birth actually, of an independent southern Sudanese government is a mark on the history of the Middle East and a station in our new future.
Both sides have agreed to boost their cooperation in all fields. Israel's foothold in South Sudan is significant as it continues its effort to build a Christian alliance in Africa to fend off Arab influence and the growing Islamic trends there. Observers say Israel has found fertile soil in Africa's military conflicts to market its weapons industry and gain influence. But Israeli ties to Sudan's southern region go back to the 1960s, when it offered aid and training to the rebels fighting the northern government. In that context, it's not surprising that it took less than 24 hours for Israel to recognize the newborn Republic of South Sudan this year. An Israeli ambassador is due to arrive in Juba in the near future. But in a sign of just how deep the ties between the two states are, Salva Kiir recently told a senior member of the ruling Likud party that South Sudan would be one of a handful of countries to establish an embassy in Jerusalem, despite the city's disputed status. Last month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hosted the leaders of Uganda and Kenya, who Israel considers as natural allies. Israel also hopes to repatriate more than 52,000 illegal African immigrants who crossed into the country through its porous border with Egypt back to their countries, including South Sudan. Mohammed Shakir for Inside Story.
So, should its neighbours be worried about South Sudan's relations with Israel? To answer the question, I'm joined by my guests. In Jerusalem, Herb Kynan is diplomatic correspondent with the Jerusalem Post. In Cambridge, Jacob Ekol is the director of the South Sudanese information website, gertong.net, and he's chairman of the Association for Media Development in Southern Sudan. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Thank you for being with us. Herb Kynan in Jerusalem, let me begin with you. What is the relationship and the history between these two nations?
Look, I think the relationship now it's starting on a, as far as an Israeli perspective, it's starting on a, on a very positive foot. Israel recognized South Sudan, I think, 24 hours after they declared independence. And from an Israeli perspective, South Sudan is situated in a very geographically important region. Fundamentally, the geographical interest is to kind of block Iranian inroads into the area, and we've seen Iranian inroads there. We have a problem with Somalia. You've seen arms flow from Iran through Sudan into Sinai and then into Gaza, and I think that's a major concern for Israel.
Can you explain why? I mean, I don't quite follow why Israel would want to take what is already a fairly fractious relationship with Iran into a different continent on the basis of something that doesn't immediately seem to pose any threat to Israel, given the distance between the nations.
I'm not sure that Israel is the one who's taken the relationship to another continent. I mean, we have seen Iranian attempts to smuggle arms through Africa into Gaza. That presents a serious problem for Israel, and one shouldn't expect Israel to sit on its hands and pretend it's not happening and not try to combat it in any way.
All right, Jacob Ackel in Cambridge, let me ask you to comment on some of those observations. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I do agree. In fact, I can't understand why it has taken the president of the government of South Sudan to visit Israel almost 6 months after our independence.
How does South Sudan see welcoming Israel into South Sudan being in its interest if the idea is simply to counter Khartoum?
Well, I mean, the Khartoum has been friendly with Iran for a very long time. President Bashir has hidden that relationship between Khartoum and Tehran.
So what you seem to be saying,
yes,
then is that South Sudan wants some kind of a military relationship with Israel to counter what it sees as a threat from Khartoum.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what South Sudan actually wants or what the government of South Sudan wants. But I think South Sudanese would like to have that kind of relationship, a military relationship. Already the territory is being bombed by Khartoum, and really there is no one supporting them.
Herb, is this really something that Israel wants to get involved in? I mean, it can fight Iran's relationship with Khartoum and Gaza in many ways. Does it really want to embroil itself in what seems like it's going to be a continuing problem area in East Africa?
Israel's interest in South Sudan is not only connected to Iran. I think that's one of a number of regions that it's there. I think it's a key reason, but it's not the only one. As far as your question is concerned of whether Israel wants to be embroiled in the war down there, I mean, obviously, you know, Israel's not looking to get involved in any wars between South Sudan and Sudan. Israel's looking for a relationship with the fledgling country of Sudan. I think one of the things that they're looking for is a security, you know, a degree of security cooperation. And because Israel has a number of interests in the area there, it's not necessarily going to, you know, turn its back and say, well, no, because, you know, we don't want to get embroiled there.
Jacob, let me come back to you. I mean, Herb suggests that Israel doesn't want to get involved in this relationship, but it has been all along, hasn't it? I mean, even well before South Sudan achieved its independence, it was suspected very strongly of having supported the rebels in South Sudan against Khartoum and supplying arms to them. The situation has been of that nature for quite some time. But do you think that Israel is not going to continue that?
Well, I wish they would. But, you know, in their historical relationship, yes, the Israelis have been supportive of the Anyanya, the first movement of the South Sudan Liberation Movement, and then the second one, which was led by Colonel John Garang. So, yes, there has been a historical relationship between South Sudan and Israel. And many South Sudanese would hope that this would continue.
That sort of military relationship and that military interest that Israel has sort of put itself, position that Israel has put itself into, is, again, just from a strategic and perhaps philosophical perspective, is still a slightly puzzling one. I mean, its activities in Africa haven't always been the most successful. Its key interests don't really lie in Africa at the moment, or at least on the surface they don't. And to get itself involved in something that in many ways might be regarded as a colonial enterprise in an area where perhaps it isn't seen as being particularly interested. I mean, isn't that just going to throw up any number of potential diplomatic obstacles and problems in the future?
Look, I mean, I think it's kind of hypocritical to yell at Israel for perhaps having a security cooperation with a state that's in some kind of conflict, as if Israel is the only country in the world that does this. And I just remind you, Russia just sold state-of-the-art missiles to Syria. So, you know, to single out Israel for that, I think, is a bit questionable.
Well, I'm not entirely sure who you're talking about when you say yelling at Israel. I'm not sure anyone's been doing any yelling at all. But the point that you make is exactly the point I'm trying to make, because history has proven pretty conclusively that whether it be Russia, whether it be the United States, whether it be Britain, whether it be France, Germany, people who've gone into Africa with intentions like this have inevitably ended up in a pretty unpleasant situation. I'm just wondering why Israel would want to join them.
I don't think anybody really believes that Israel is going into Africa in order to colonize Africa. Israel's going into Africa, or it has an interest in a relationship with Africa because it has interests there, like other countries have throughout the world. We have a changing region in the Middle East. Israel is interested now in kind of expanding its realm of friends, or its circle of friends, because we don't exactly know what's going to be happening in our own neighborhood. I think it's only reasonable to think that Israel is going to look elsewhere, and one of those places to look is a place that's not that far away, and that's Africa.
Jacob, whether it be mere friendship, whether it be colonization, imperial interest, commercial interest, let's get into one area that has come up very frequently throughout the entire relationship that Israel has had with Sudan, and well before that, and that is the issue of water here. Now, the idea that Israel has wanted to get water from the Nile through Egypt has been, as I say, a very long-standing one. And the idea that Israel might be able to control some elements of its relationship with Egypt by controlling the water that comes through Sudan is one that a lot of people are questioning. What are your thoughts on that area?
Well, I don't really know what Israel wants with water, but I can only say that they are very good at utilizing the very little water they have in their own country. And South Sudan is got the problem of too much water and very little water throughout the year. So there is a need to have a friend who can help you do that, control the floods as well as the droughts.
Herb, what are your thoughts on the water question?
That smacks me a bit conspiratorial to think that Israel's helping out Sudan so they can control the water flowing to Egypt. That seems a little bit of a far stretch to me.
Hardly conspiracy. I mean, there is a long history of Israel attempting to negotiate with Egypt and with countries from Eritrea to Ethiopia to Sudan on how the Nile water may be used to the benefit of Israel.
Again, I don't think that's a reasonable thing to think right now. That the reason Israel is interested in this relationship is because it wants to control the Nile, the flow of the Nile. I think that's just a bit much. Look, as far as Israel's own water situation, I mean, with the advent of desalination, I think Israel's one of the desalination powers right now. Water for Israel is not as critical as it was like 20 years ago because there are ways to create water which we didn't have in the past. There will be people who will be asking the question about the Nile. I don't take that very seriously.
Okay, well, I'll get back to that in just a second and quote you a few people who are taking it pretty seriously. But let me just give Jacob a chance to talk about this. Jacob, the water element is one aspect of that relationship, but commercial interests and things like that form other parts of the potential here. What do you think South Sudan, apart from the military support, can get from Israel?
What they have been talking about in Jerusalem has been to support South Sudan in its agriculture and water control in the area. So yes, there is a lot there that Israel can do in terms of infrastructure as well as agriculture.
Well, can you tell us what?
Agriculture as well as infrastructure.
Right, but I mean, do you have any specific details on how this relationship is progressing and what strategically that South Sudan is going to do on this regard?
Well, South Sudan needs an experienced country like Israel. As I said before, Israel has come from a very long way back, a very small country in the middle of Middle East, as it were. And they are doing very well indeed for their people. So yes, there is no doubt that a relationship between Israel and South Sudan would be beneficial to South Sudan.
All right, at this point, let's bring in a new guest. Gamal Nkrumah is deputy editor of Al Ahram Weekly, and he joins us live from Cairo. Gamal, thank you for being with us. We've just been talking about Israel's interests in South Sudan. We've touched on the obvious military interest and perhaps South Sudan's desire for some kind of military support against the perceived threat from the north. We've also touched upon the possible interests in resources, particularly the waters of the Nile that make their way through Sudan. Just give us a summary of your thoughts as to what the situation is here and why Israel was so quick to get involved in the new nation of South Sudan.
Well, this is South Sudan is a very crucial country in terms of Israel's strategic interests in the Nile Basin. And the reason is that there are about 250,000 southern Sudanese and people from Darfur who are seeking asylum or economic refuge in Israel. There are other reasons as well. One is that the security situation in southern Sudan is very unstable, and the government of southern Sudan, as a sovereign independent nation, it's no more part of the Arab Sudan in Khartoum, and so they are seeking to bolster the strategic and military security interests, and they think that Israel has the capacity to do so.
That may well be the case, but would it not be more, I guess, normal for a new country like South Sudan to look to the US, to NATO, to the United Nations perhaps, for that kind of support than to Israel?
No, they don't. I don't think the leadership of the SPLM, the ruling party in southern Sudan, would like to get the US or Washington involved in this. They do realize that Israel has a very capable security apparatus and military apparatus, and they want to make use of it. The other reason is that southern Sudan is the most underdeveloped part of Africa, with very low per capita incomes, and they do think that Israel can provide the technical expertise, especially in agricultural development and agribusiness, to prop up the Sudanese economy, the South Sudan economy.
What does South Sudan have to offer to Israel in return for its support in military and in technical development?
Yes, of course, Israel is energy starved nation. Or South Sudan is a major producer of oil, and the Israelis, given the geographical proximity, especially through the Red Sea from Port Sudan, which is the oil terminal, to Eilat in southern Israel on the Red Sea, South Sudan is a most attractive country, which is a neighbor. Even though Israel is not in Africa, it's very close geographically to the Horn of Africa and to East Africa through the Red Sea. So this is a very strategic, of strategic importance to Israel.
Herb, let me just touch on the issue of the immigration that we've just heard from Gamal, and it's been a big issue in Israel recently. A lot of protests against the number of people coming in from Africa. Is this a I don't want to call it a war, but is this a battle that Israel wants to fight in Africa? I mean, wouldn't it make more sense to control its borders closer to home?
I think it's a dual-pronged effort. I think on the one hand, they're building a security fence. They're building a fence on the Egyptian border, which we've never had in the past. One of the reasons is to keep out the illegal infiltrators. But there are tens of thousands of them here already, and you have to think of how you're going to deal with it. So they've come up with a plan of repatriation, and I think I think this is one of the topics of discussions that the president had when he was here.
Well, Jacob, let me broaden it out to some of the neighbors in Africa. Now, the relationship between Juba and Khartoum is obviously the most immediate issue at hand here, and surely Khartoum is not going to be happy to consider that Juba may be receiving armed support from a nation as advanced in weapons sales as Israel is. But what about the other countries surrounding there too? How do you think they might respond to the possibility of this relationship becoming stronger?
Well, I don't think they have discussed any arming of South Sudan yet, not in their agenda anyway, as far as I can gather. But there is no doubt that countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda would not object at all to this kind of relationship. Khartoum, I don't know whether they would like the idea, but in honesty, I think that South Sudan is an independent country, is not part of Khartoum anymore. And Khartoum will just have to work very hard for a good relationship with South Sudan.
Gamal, any thoughts from you on the broader repercussions of this axis around the rest of the region?
Khartoum doesn't have a leg to stand on, so to say, because, as mentioned by your guest, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda have very good working relationships with Israel, and South Sudan wants to join in, and it's under no obligation whatsoever to take the green light from Khartoum, because Juba, South Sudan, is an independent nation now, is a sovereign nation, and has the right to deal with whatever country it deems the relationship, the working relationship, would be in its best interest.
Well, no one's doubting it has the right to do what it likes, but we know that international diplomatic relations are never really quite that simple. You don't see any potential for friction with any neighbors.
No, I think Khartoum is at the moment really saddled with its own problems, domestic concerns. It has problems in Darfur, it has problems in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, and these provinces do have political affiliations with South Sudan and with the ruling party in South Sudan, the SPLM, and therefore Khartoum has more than its share of domestic concerns, and I think it is just not appropriate to busy itself with the diplomatic affairs of its southern neighbor.
All right, let me stop you there and give the final word to Herb in Jerusalem. Herb, what broader interests strategically do you think Israel has in that area, or are we likely to see a greater presence?
Look, I think you're going to see a greater presence. I mean, the Prime Minister Netanyahu is planning the first visit to Africa, or extended visit to Africa by an Israeli Prime Minister since 1966. Right now, he's planning to go to the three countries that were mentioned, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Kenya. There's talk that he might even visit South Sudan. I mean, Israel obviously sees that there is something that it can do there, and it wants to further that relationship. But it's not only concentrated in East Africa. 2 months ago, Israel opened up an embassy in Ghana, in West Africa. It has strong relationships in West Africa as well. And again, I think this is part of Israel's attempt to look at what's going on in the region and say, hey, we have to extend our reach a little bit outward, because we don't know what's going to happen in our immediate neighborhood.
All right, clearly much more to come on this story in the future, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed to all our guests in Jerusalem, Herb Kainon, in Cairo, Gamal Nkrumah, and in Cambridge, Jacob Acol. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us on this edition of the programme. And if you want to send us your feedback, just email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. In the meantime, thanks for watching and goodbye.